Today we'll be starting off with David from x23.ai, and we're going to be deciphering DAOs, insights from off-chain dynamics. So I'd like you to all give a nice warm welcome to... Mic's not working.
Mic check. All right, cool. Thank you everyone for coming this early morning, and thanks for waiting. So my name is David. I'll be talking about deciphering DAOs. Let's get the slides up, please, on the screen. Yep. Okay. So this, I've got the clicker now. All right, that seems to work. Cool. So this talk, we'll talk about DAOs, protocols, and communities in Web3. We'll analyze some qualitative data and a bit of quantitative data as well. And we'll try to create insights from that data. And the point or the goal of this talk is to enable you to be able to draw your own insights or conclusions from various sources of data about DAOs. Okay, it's a quick introduction about me. So my name's David, founder of x23.ai, which I'll go through a bit later of what exactly we do. Previously, I worked for Aave. I was part of the Aave Genesis team, seeing it grow from less than 1 million TVL to more than 20 billion TVL. Then also I was part of Coinbase in the early days. And then also, my son is half Romanian. So, you know, bună dimineața, Saromana, yeah, woo, Romanian pride. Okay, so let's see, with the room, how many people here are involved in, let's say, more than one DAO? Put your hand up. Okay, more than 5 DAOs? No? Okay. So generally people will be involved in multiple different DAOs, but everyone has a different definition of what a DAO actually is. Right? So the DAO is meant to stand for decentralized autonomous organization, but most of them are either decentralized or not really decentralized, autonomous, or most of them actually aren't autonomous at all, it's just a group of people. And some of them are organizations, and some are not even really organized, they're just like a Telegram group. So the question is, like, what are these like DAOs looking like inside? If you're not part of like so many different DAOs, how do you know what's going on? Well, generally you'll see like a group of friends. That's how they start, or sometimes enemies and foes arguing with each other, and that can be sometimes good or sometimes bad for DAOs. And also with a lot of other people, spectators watching those fights happen. In sort of the worst cases, some DAOs can just be people hopping on the train, maybe hoping for an airdrop, and just like spectators just hopping along for the ride. And in the worst case, in my opinion, DAOs can just be echo chambers. Right, so our goal for today is how do we differentiate between these different types of DAOs, like which ones are active, which ones are healthy. You know, if you want to be involved in a DAO or protocol or community, how can you evaluate that? And one way to evaluate that is to look at the data, but the question is, what sort of data should we look at? Right, so price activity is not indicative of the activity of a community, or it doesn't indicate the health of a DAO or protocol. And this is a good example because traders will be trading really anything, even dead projects like EOS. You can see the price goes up. So don't look at the price if you're looking at sort of the health of a community. We can look at social media, but once again, with social media data, you have bots just botting and spamming the algorithm. So also we can't rely on social media data as well. With voting activity, this is more quantitative data. So voting activity is a bit more interesting. We can rely on it a little bit. So this is a Uniswap protocol on Tally, and we can see that there's about 400,000 holders of the Uni token, and about 40,000 of those holders are actively voting. So that's about 10% of the community. So that's relatively healthy. That's a pretty high participation rate for the DAO governance voting. Something else we can look at as well from a quantitative side is forum activity, right? And the reason for forum activity is because we get the qualitative data of what people are actually talking about, right? The topics that are important, you know, what's interesting to that community, and also we get to see the pseudo-identities. So who's talking about what, right? And how long have they been part of the communities? Okay, so back to our questions. What sort of data should we look at to determine the health of these DAOs or protocols and communities? I would say it's qualitative data, like forum stuff, and quantitative, both votes on-chain and off-chain. Historically, so based from when the DAO first started all the way to now, and across Web3, because we need to compare and contrast different communities and see how they are, right? All right, so we crunched the data, luckily. So I'll talk a little bit about what X23 does. So we uncover what's happening across Web3 by aggregating, condensing, and prioritizing content so you can make better decisions. And we apply large language models to this data to like help you essentially give context to that data. All right, so as part of what we do, we have historic data across nearly 30 DAOs now, DAOs and protocols and communities across Web3. It's forum discussions, snapshot voting, GitHub pull requests, and GitHub code repositories. And so there's actually more than 45, probably closer to 50,000 pieces of content that we're indexing and that sort of our systems understand now. And one feature that we recently released was community rankings. So with the community rankings, you can see it's sort of like a CoinMarketCap or CoinGecko of communities and DAOs. And I'll go through each of these so then you can draw some insights about these communities, right? So what can we learn from voting activity and forum activity? So there'll be a few things that I'll go over. So firstly is categories. So what is actually being talked about in these communities? What are the big topics and the big important things that are happening there? The active topics. Are there more discussions happening now, or are there less, or is it the same? Is the community growing, or is it like having less activity and shrinking essentially? Who are the authors contributing? And what percentage? Is it all just one team or one founder that's making all the posts, or is it a lot of contributors contributing to that protocol? And then also vote dynamics. So are there dissenting opinions, like the initial images? Are people fighting each other inside the protocol, or are they all just agreeing and going along with whatever gets voted in? So if we start with categories, we can look at categories across all time, and these are the top protocols, right? So I think you can see here, we have MakerDAO, Ethereum, Aave, Balancer, ENS, and Gitcoin. So that's ranked by the most activity across all time. So MakerDAO, historically, because they've been around for 5+ years, has a lot of activity on their protocol. And this is one of the categories, the top category that they've talked about throughout the history. It's stablecoin, because MakerDAO creates DAI, a stablecoin. That makes a lot of sense. We have Ethereum, and they're talking about developer tooling. Aave talks about lending. These sort of categories make a lot of sense. Maybe with Balancer, they talk about DeFi, not specifically the AMM or the DEX. So that's interesting. So they don't focus on the AMM part, but they focus on the general DeFi integrations, right? ENS is identity protocol, of course, and Gitcoin talks about grant and funding. So that's historically what they've been talking about. So that's sort of, we can understand that this is what's important to that community. If I want to be involved in that community, these are the sort of things I need to talk about. Or if I have some value to add to that community, this is how I can add value. It's also interesting when we compare the all-time categories to the weekly categories, because these communities are living communities and they fluctuate over time. So if we look at the weekly categories, some interesting insights you might come across some interesting insights. So firstly, we have MakerDAO. They added a new category called vote. So there's an important vote happening last week, or around voting. I don't exactly know, right? This is the LLM telling me. With Ethereum, there's less talk about developer tooling, and there's more controversial things happening, right? I think some controversial proposals were posed in the Ethereum community. With Aave, there's the same categories. Right, so Aave has been very consistent with like talking or caring about a certain part. Like the discussions always happen around certain topics. Right, so that's fairly interesting. With Balancer, they've been talking about funding because they've been giving grants, I think. ENS is less about events, more about developer tooling. So they're repositioning themselves now away from events and, let's say, getting their name out there because they're very well known now, and more to developer tooling. And then we can see, finally, Gitcoin is now focused on social impact. So recently they announced Gitcoin V2. So it's a whole different track that they're going down now. Okay, so that's categories. Now if we look at topics discussed over time, we can also see some interesting insights, especially if we compare all-time topics, let's say the number of topics, the number of activity that was happening, compared to what's happened in the last week. And you can see here, like MakerDAO is ranked #1 on all time, and then last week, it was ranked number 4. Whereas Ethereum and Aave, they've been consistently ranked 2 and 3. Right? So what happened with MakerDAO that last week was it dropped so much in activity? So we can find this out by plotting the activity over time. Right? So this is from the start of MakerDAO over here in 2019 all the way to, let's say, today. You can see that there's a large peak of activity and then it just drops off. Right? So is that healthy for MakerDAO? What does that indicate? Does it indicate that MakerDAO is like stagnating? Or are they just being quiet, like a quiet period for their end game scenario? We don't really know unless we compare across Web3, right? So this is Aave's topics over time. You can see there's a big spike, but the trend is generally growing. So that's interesting. That might indicate that Aave is consistently growing. And also if we look at Ethereum, we can also see that Ethereum activity is consistently growing as well, reaching a peak actually. And it becomes more interesting when we overlay these 3 communities on top of each other, then it becomes clear from this graph at least that MakerDAO activity from a community perspective has been stagnating, or there's less activity happening, right? So I leave it up to you to decide whether you think MakerDAO is stagnating or it's just in a quiet period. But we can see that the standard for like a lively protocol like Ethereum or Aave, it should be an uptrend. And one other community that's interesting is Optimism at the bottom here. So it sort of came out of nowhere, and now it's in the top 5. And this is the graph of Optimism, right? So they just started in 2022 in February. And if we overlay Optimism, they are the orange line here. So you can see Optimism burst on the scene with the activity. So this is what a growing, healthy community looks like, right? So if you want to be part of like a growing community, like Optimism is the way to go. So we can see the uptrend definitely happening there. The next part of, let's say, healthy communities or evaluating communities and DAOs is around authors and contributors, right? So this is, we've ranked the data by the top contributors. So we can see here, let's say Ethereum has nearly 1,000 contributors across all time. Aave has 600 plus. We can go down the list, but we'll focus on just 3 communities. So Aave, Optimism, and at the bottom, the graph, right? Okay, so here we can see Aave has more than 600 contributors across all time. Optimism, 500 contributors across all time, and that's only been since 2022. And the graph has 400. So they're not too far apart, right? So they're sort of similar in the amount of contributors they have. And we can break down who's actually contributing. So for Aave, Chaos Labs is the highest contributor across all time. So they've posted 129 topics out of 1,500 topics. So that's about 8.4% of the content that they've generated. The system account, which is the official Optimism account, they've posted about 12% of all the topics. And Oliver from the graph has posted about 4.76. So you can see here that, let's say the graph, Oliver has posted nearly like half as much. He's a top contributor in the graph, but he's posted half as much as a top contributor in Aave. So what does that mean, right? Does it mean that the graph is more decentralized because there's more top contributors? Because maybe Aave, Chaos Labs is doing most of the work in these contributions? Well, not really, because we have to use this data with the top contributors, and we can compare that with also voting trends. So on the right here, you can see that this is sort of a scale of how controversial the voting trends have been. Right? You can see that Aave is very controversial, whereas the graph is very unanimous in its voting trends. So if we break this down, here's an example of an Aave proposal. Right? And you see over here, this is sort of X23 interface, by the way. So you can see here that this proposal, there was nearly 50% voting yes and 40% voting no. So there's a lot of friction in the community of like disagreement. Right? And the same one for Aave again, there's 55% voted to reduce the stream and 45% voted to cancel it. Right? So it's quite controversial in the ecosystem. Now if we look at something from the graph, we can see the graph, 99.72% supported this proposal, which is nearly 100%. And this one also nearly 100%. Right? So what does that mean from the perspective of who's more decentralized, what's more healthy for the community? These questions I leave up to you guys to determine. It really depends on, I guess, what you see as more healthy. Let's say the graph is, let's say technically, it's more decentralized, right? But the community, it looks like everyone's just following whatever, the founding team or whoever has power, everything's just passing. So there's not really much friction. Whereas Aave, it's like growing, but then also there's a lot of friction, right? So to me, that seems like there's a lot of like, let's say, different parties involved, right? So in a way, in a certain lens, that can be seen as more, I guess, healthy. Okay, and of course, I'll just point out that this can, of course, fluctuate over time. So this is the monthly trends, voting trends of Aave. So you can see it's not as controversial, it's just contentious, right? So depending on what proposals are being posted week to week or day to day, these statistics can change. Okay, so how do we differentiate between these different DAOs, which are more active and which are more healthy? We look at the data that I mentioned, and just a disclaimer that I don't mean to like, let's say, I'm not criticizing MakerDAO or the Graph. You know, I both like hold their tokens and I support the projects early on. I think that it's just depending on like what you feel is more important for a DAO. Maybe you want to be part of a community that's more centralized, so you can play a bigger part, or maybe you want to be part of a very decentralized community, or regulators want to find out what's really decentralized. They can look at this sort of data. So if you want to look at the community rankings, this is a QR code that you can scan to go straight to the community rankings. And I think we have a few more minutes, so we can take questions. And then finally, that X23, we're a startup, we're hiring, always looking for talent. So if you want to work at the intersection of large language models / AI and crypto, reach out to me on Telegram or email. Happy to talk more. But that's it. Do you want to open the floor for questions? Questions? Yeah, go for it. We'll get the microphones working.
My question is it fair to compare, let's say, Graph and Aave, because they have two completely different protocols, and is it fair to say that because they have different interests, you can't really compare them?
So we're not comparing the, let's say, the interest of the... So the question is, is it fair to compare such different protocols, Aave and the Graph? Because Aave is a lending DeFi protocol, the Graph is more decentralized indexing infrastructure. Like, we're not comparing what the communities are talking about, we're comparing the amount of activity that's happening and who's creating that activity, right? So in a way, we're comparing, like, where's the source of all this evolution in the protocol? So the short answer is, I think it's fair to compare. But of course, it depends on what insights you're trying to find out. Awesome. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I think there's another question just there.
How about the SoFi, the social decentralized? Do you do any research on that? And what is your opinion? It is sustainable. There is a project now that can be in the market also in the future. This is my question. Thank you.
Okay, so I think if I understand this question correctly, what do I think of SocialFi, decentralized social media? I mean, so we index about 30 different protocols and communities at the moment. None of them are SocialFi yet, but we do plan to expand to 100 plus protocol coverage. I think there's a lot of activity happening on Farcaster and Lens. So those are viable social media platforms. It's still an open question, still very early days, but I'd say those two are the biggest ones. Of course, there's Reddit as well. Reddit's not fully decentralized, but I think they do some token experiments here and there. Cool.
Any more questions? Nope. Well, I want to say a big thank you, and this was really an interesting talk, and I'm actually really looking forward to see how I can use it. So another big round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.